It's now my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, Gene Dodaro, Comptroller General for the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Dodaro became the 8th Comptroller General in the United States and the head of the U.S. Government Accountability Office on December 22, 2010, when he was confirmed by the United States Senate. He was nominated by President Obama in September of 2010 from a list of candidates selected by a bipartisan and bicameral congressional commission. He had been serving as acting Comptroller General since March of 2008. Please join me in welcoming Gene Dodaro.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be able to spend some time with you talking about both the challenges and the opportunities in information technology. I'm going to touch upon three subjects this morning with my remarks before I take questions. One is the urgent need to effectively implement the Federal Information Technology Reform Act. Second is the critical need to step up our safeguards in the cybersecurity area to effectively reduce our vulnerability. And third is the essential role of information technology in helping promote the effective implementation of the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, which is to make information on federal spending much more transparent and available to the public and the private as part of a major reform. First, as most of you know, from GAO's perspective, we evaluate everything across the breadth and scope of the federal government's responsibilities, and we highlight high-risk areas for the Congress. In February this past year, we added to our high-risk list, which basically is focused on what we believe to be the highest risks across the federal government. There are 32 areas on the list right now. We added IT acquisitions and operations to the high-risk list. Too frequently, there have been failed IT operations that have not been completed. There are cost and schedule delays, and with little positive effect on mission outcomes. There's a need to dramatically improve the performance of the management of IT investments by better and more consistently implementing best practices in a disciplined manner. And there's it's very important that the federal government get a much better return on the investment it makes in about $80 billion every year in IT operations and acquisitions. Now, in putting this area on the high-risk list, we also recognize that over the past 6 years, we've made over 800 recommendations for improvement to try to achieve these objectives, but only 32% have been implemented. So the agencies need to do a much better job implementing the recommendations. We usually get agreement that the recommendations are to be implemented, but it takes way too long to effectuate the needed changes. In deciding how to take this area off the high-risk list, we took the unusual step of being very specific on our criteria. One is over the next 4 years that the agencies implement at least 80% of the recommendations that we've made to them. Secondly, that they effectively implement IT initiatives. At least 80% of them meet the standard of delivering functionality within a 12-month period of time. So the incremental development initiative is also underscored in being able to come off the list. And thirdly, that they achieve the savings, at least 80% of the savings from Portfolio Stat, which is expected to save $6 billion, and 80% of the savings from the Data Center Consolidation Initiative, which is expected to save $5 billion more dollars. So implement the recommendations, institute disciplined processes on incremental development, which was originally the idea behind the 1996 Clinger-Cohen Act for modular development. The FITARA basically takes that and reinforces all the principles of Clinger-Cohen, but takes it to an operational level. So all the provisions of FITARA, if they're effectively implemented properly, can contribute also to helping improve the management of IT and the performance in helping achieve better return on investment and goals going forward. It's essential. Now, the key elements of FITARA, I'm sure you've talked about it a lot today. I'm not going to review all of those, but I just want to underscore the CIO roles and responsibilities and the strengthening of their authorities is essential. This again was contemplated when the CIO positions were first established in 1996 in the Clinger-Cohen legislation, but it hasn't been effectively implemented. This legislative initiative in FITARA gives it a lot more specificity and a lot more behind it in terms of law, in terms of giving the CIOs greater authority and responsibility in the areas of budget, approving contracts, and increasing the transparency and giving them more authority. So we're going to be taking a look at how that's implemented. It also increases the transparency of how projects are being administered. In the past, that wasn't always clear. Baselines were reset over time, and you really didn't know when they needed to take urgent action to stop bad investments in the beginning and redirect things earlier. So greater transparency and incremental development is very important in order to instill more discipline in the IT projects over a period of time. Also, it emphasizes portfolio stat, the data center consolidations. There are billions of dollars that can be saved in IT operations and acquisitions that could be put to better use or reduce the cost of the investment over time. Also, the Act emphasizes trying to use strategic sourcing more to leverage the government's buying power. This is something that's not been done before. We've urged the GAO strategic sourcing across the federal government. We've looked at the private sector. The private sector achieves about 90% of their contract dollars are under strategic sourcing, and they get about 10% savings every year. The federal government is nowhere near that amount. Last time we looked at it, it was 5 or 10% of the federal government's procurement dollars under strategic sourcing, and much smaller returns on the cost savings over time. So the Federal Information Technology and Reform Act is very essential to improving this area and essential to making progress toward getting off of GAO's high-risk list. And contrary to urban legend, it is possible to get off GAO's high-risk list. We've been doing this since 1990, and a third of the areas that we've had on the list have been removed after making sufficient progress. We have 5 criteria for coming off the list: leadership commitment, the capacity, the people, and the resources necessary to fix the problem, a good corrective action plan that deals with root causes, a monitoring effort, and actually demonstrating some results. So we'll be looking at that in the context of the 3 criteria that I mentioned before. Now let me turn to computer security for a minute. We first put computer security on our high-risk list in 1997. It was the first time that we identified a risk across the entire federal government that we wanted to highlight for attention. In 2003, we expanded it from computer security across the federal government to protecting critical infrastructure throughout the United States. Most of the assets in the computer field are in the private sector hands, and a lot more things like the electricity grid, financial markets, and other issues. And then this past February, when we did our latest update, we further identified the need to protect personally identifiable information because the number of incidents have been growing, and we were concerned about that as well. We've issued in the past 6 years over 2,000 recommendations in the cybersecurity area. 840 are still open, so there have been some progress, but much more needs to be done. We mention this every year also in the context of agencies not having effective, comprehensive information security programs in the areas of access controls, segregation of duties, configuration management, contingency planning, and also having well-formulated program and continuous monitoring type of efforts, and then take action on that more systematically. This is a really serious problem. We've tried to bring attention to it for a number of years now, but the threats keep growing and evolving and becoming more difficult to deal with. But the federal government has to confront this area going forward. Lastly, let me mention the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act. This legislation, if you're familiar with usaspending.gov, back in 2006, the Congress passed legislation to require a publicly available website that would show all the federal awards, grants in the grants area as well. Over time, that's been accessible to people, but it hasn't been accurate. The last time we looked at this, we found over $600 billion in federal spending that wasn't included in the website that was supposed to, and the information was not accurate. It was only 2 to 7% of the data elements, the 21 data elements that we checked from a statistical sample that were supposed to be displayed were accurate and matched the original records in that area. And so the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act takes that concept and expands it to all federal spending, and it requires more information, not just on awards, but how much money was appropriated, how much money was obligated, how much was spent. So it goes through the whole life cycle of federal spending. It also requires the information to be in machine-readable, downloadable format, so it's accessible to the private sector and citizens, can be analyzed and manipulated more easily. It requires data standards to be set so the information is collected consistently across the federal government, which it has not been, so you can compare. It also requires the spending to be linked with federal programs. Right now, there is not a comprehensive inventory of federal programs, and the spending is not linked to those programs. So this is essential to look at the efficiency and effectiveness of the federal government and to provide greater transparency and accountability to the government. And I mention this in the context of information technology because a lot of this information, technology has to be essential. Machine readable, downloadable format. You need extensible language markup to be able to implement this, data standards, technical schema, etc. So this won't work effectively without good information technology support, and it won't work effectively and achieve its objectives if agencies don't improve the quality of the information that goes into this data issue. So information technology is so essential to the federal government's operations. We're on a long-term, unsustainable fiscal path. We need to be more efficient and effective in the government. Information technology, too often, we've wasted billions of dollars with little positive outcome, and we need to do much better in that area going forward, not only to reduce waste, but to improve the performance of the federal government for the benefit of the American people. So with that, I'd like to just open it up for questions. Yes?
Tom Dickinson with TechCast Global. Just picking up on the point you just made there about the billions of dollars that have been wasted. Have you all gone back and done any kind of a comprehensive analysis of some of these major initiatives that have failed at great cost with no end product for the purposes of lessons learned to, let everyone know how to avoid things like this in the future?
Yes. We've both critiqued a lot of these activities over time and have issued reports on best practices. And what we find is the requirements aren't well defined up front, that the discipline breaks down in the process, that it's not a modular development approach. And we've been tracking these projects for years. I was involved in leading GAO's information technology work before I became sort of the deputy and then now the Comptroller General. We were looking at the breakdowns in tax system modernization efforts, $1 billion in the 1990s. And so we took a lot of the best practices work that we had done, and that led to the establishment of the Klinger-Cohen Act to put CIOs in place, to have discipline processes, modular development. The best practices are well known, We've published a lot of work on them, but they're not implemented consistently and in a diligent fashion over time. It takes hard work. The problems are well known.
Is there an enforcement mechanism that you can apply?
Well, that's, I think, what FITARA attempts to do. Now, FITARA puts requirements in place that if they, for 4 consecutive quarters, if they find that a project's deemed high risk, they have to take action on it. What we've tried to do at the GAO when developing this criteria, we're trying to intervene much earlier in the development of these processes before the money is spent. You can go in and take a look using our methodologies and tell when you've got a troubled project that needs attention and stop it and redirect it right away before you go through and you spend hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars of information. If you look at our high-risk report that was issued in February, it's on our website, gao.gov. Just type in high-risk updates, February 15th, I think. And in that section on IT acquisitions, we list the best practices that we've identified, and there's sites to all of our methodologies and material. Sure. It's a matter of execution. It's not a matter of not knowing how to do this right. There's no mystery. Yes. This is definitely the best cup holder I've ever had. Yes.
Hi, yeah. So I work with a lot of innovative small businesses that focus on the federal market, but they continually tell me they come back and cannot get a meeting with agencies. So they're going through SBA, they're going through OSDBU, but often they have products that commercial companies are snapping up and grabbing, but no one in the government knows that that solution even exists. So an RFI won't come out, an RFP won't come out, and they're in a situation where they're trying to find a way to get a meeting or get that information out. What are you all doing to help open doors to folks that really are innovative and are running lean, interesting businesses?
Yeah, that's really not our job at the GAO. We're in the legislative branch, and we provide oversight on the executive branch. I mean, that's really a responsibility of the executive branch, either the OMB or GSA. There's a Chief Information Officers Council that was established in the Clear-Cohen Act. That council has regular meetings. They're the proper venue for asking that question and make things available.
Have you all done any work on reforms in that area? I mean, I guess that was sort of my question, is that on GAO's radar?
Not currently. Yes.
Thanks, Steve Young with Innovate. The topic came up earlier about metrics for improved service to the citizens, actual outcomes of IT efforts. Has GAO done any work on how does one measure actual service improvements? And can you point us to anything in that area?
Yes, we've done a lot of research about how the private sector has done it. And I'll just give you one example on customer service to IRS and answering the telephones, okay? And how much time does it take for somebody to get through? Do they get a proper answer? I mean, there are all kind of metrics that are available both in the private sector and in the public sector, that need to be done. We've been long working on the Government Performance and Results Act, which really requires agencies not only develop strategic plans and set performance goals, but also to have metrics in place. The Modernization Act in 2010 for the Government Performance and Results Act requires agencies on a public website, performance.gov, to list the performance measures and metrics that they use. And that's available to the public. So we look at that all the time and evaluate those activities, and to make sure that agencies have performance metrics. We suggest new ones for them to look at, and we provide better insights for them to be able to do that in that area and hold them accountable. Where they're not available, when we go in and take a look, we come up with our own way to judge performance based upon consulting experts and research in that area. So you'll you'll find a lot of information in the GAO website and in our work. I'd also mention that we list key areas across the federal government. We have a section on the website that talks about key issues. So for every federal agency and most major federal programs, we have specific recommendations open. Many of them are in better measuring the performance of their program and taking action. Unfortunately, in many areas, the agencies don't do program evaluations. Like we looked at how many programs were available for science, technology, engineering, and math areas to promote those fields. And there were 209 programs when we looked at it. Only 66% of the programs had never been evaluated. So the federal government spends a lot of money. You know, we looked at employment training programs, 47 of those. Only 4 have been evaluated over a period of time. Too often the measure that's being used, although there may be other measures, is how much money is being spent and how much is going out there. So but the agencies need to do a better job on program evaluations. We don't have a comprehensive inventory, as I mentioned, of federal programs. Many of those, funding's not always linked, and many of those we don't know how effectively they're working properly. And so with that kind of picture, it's difficult to take proper corrective action. And that's what we're trying to urge through these government-wide reforms. Sure.
Sir, good
Yeah.
morning.
I'm sorry.
John Weiler.
He beat you to the mic. You can come next, right?
I've been working with GAO, David Powner, Randy Height before this, in an attempt to start evaluating not the programs, but the processes that manage them, the acquisition process, the management process. And we haven't really seen much out of GAO that looks at the process. It looks at the programs. It doesn't, for instance, the DHS, it said, you're not following the process. If they followed the process, they'd be bankrupt. So back in 2005 or 6, Linda Springer was going to sign out a review of GAO OMB cooperation with GSA on evaluating the processes and looking at what processes are effective and which are not. Going back to your point about we know what the best practices are, is it time to look at the processes again? DOD has been unable to change its industrial age acquisition process. There are no successes. And that same process is over at FAA, at DHS, in the IC, and it doesn't get the attention it needs. We keep following the same process, as I mentioned before, and expect different results, and no one's really commenting on the process and the cost of that process.
Yeah, I'm not sure what process.
The acquisition lifecycle process. So
Yeah.
when you look at the DoD 5000, when you look at DHS's ALF acquisition lifecycle framework, when you look at FAA's process, we spend nearly 100% premium on buying things. But when GAO weighs in, it goes, well, you're not following your process. Not that the process is wrong.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, that's not exactly right, Jonathan. I mean, we've made a lot of recommendations to change the weapons acquisition process over at DoD to improve it by instituting best practices. Particularly in the area of not moving forward until technology is matured properly. We've also issued a number of guides on how to better estimate costs in the process. We're about to issue one on scheduling. We're doing one on technology readiness assessments. So we've looked at the processes and made improvements on how to change the processes. But in many cases, the process that is on paper is fine, but it's not executed properly. And so I think there's always been this tendency and temptation in the past to change the process, eliminate requirements, do this, streamline things, but then you find that you get the same outcome because whatever process is put in place is not followed properly. I think the bigger problem that we see is failed execution, not necessarily the process.
I think we have one more question.
Give my 2-minute warning. I feel like I'm at a football game. I gotta go into my 2-minute drill here.
So are you worried that, with, FITARA seems to just pass what CFOs have done, you end up with, you allocate budget to IT or non-IT. generally the allocation to the CIO for all IT is going to be less than what they think they need to do all these requirements. So, and with the CIO put in charge, put on the hook, going in front of congressional committees, do you worry there's a tendency that they're going to hunker down and invest in things that are in their interest, like cybersecurity and things like that, at the expense of investing in improved mission support?
Right. Well, the FITARA really makes the CIOs more accountable for the budget request that gets put forward. It doesn't substitute their judgment on priorities for the agency head and the management of the agency on what the priorities ought to be. So the CIOs can influence that, but they're not in control of it. And so, you know, when it comes to that, it says, okay, is the budget request justified? But it doesn't say, you know, that they're responsible for the priorities. And so it doesn't alleviate agency managers' responsibilities for doing that. But it does impose some more better discipline in the process. So I don't think it's intended that they end up being the fall guys on this thing. But it points a focus of accountability. Really, right now, you don't have clear accountability on these areas, and you have decentralized processes. But if Congress doesn't believe there are proper priorities being set for IT investments, my recommendation is they go to agency leadership about that. If those priorities are set and the Congress says, here's the amount of money we're going to give you, and we expect these results, which you've promised in the budget legislation, and that doesn't happen, then the CIOs should be responsible and accountable for it. So I think the division of responsibilities is still there, but it'll be clearer in order to do that. And they'll have pressures within the agencies to improve the program performance as well. It's not like they're going to just sit in their office with a 40-watt light bulb and come up with a plan. You know, there'll be a lot of factors and forces that create what those priorities are.
Initially, you see them going towards cyber because it's their own interest.
Well, it's own interest, but I mean, you know, let's take OPM. I mean, it was a big issue. Who'd they hold accountable? They held, you know, the head of the agency. All right, so I'm sure, you know, I'm a head of an agency. I focus on cyber issues too. I mean, it's management's responsibility. So cyber has to be an important component. It's not the only component of it. So, and given the threats and the vulnerabilities and the risk and the expectations of Congress and the American people to protect their information, you know, cyber has to be there. I don't think it's there because it's in their portfolio now. I think it's there because it's a big risk and they need to react to it. And they haven't over the past years, as I mentioned in my opening remarks.
I think,
Yes.
well, I think we're about done.
Okay, all
Well,
right.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Dodaro, for really closing out